Hello, friends. My name is Tiffany Babb, and this is the Interesting Jobs podcast, where I talk to people with interesting jobs about their day-to-day, popular misconceptions about their field, and what they wish more people understood about their jobs. Today, our very special guest is Heather Schneider. So, Heather, what do you do?
I'm the Director of Conservation and Research at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. So I both participate in conservation science, but I also lead a team of 20 other scientists, all working to understand, protect, and restore California's native plants and habitats.
That sounds fascinating. What does a regular day at your job look like?
It really varies. These days, a lot of meetings, a lot of computer work, a lot of making connections, developing scientific questions that we want to answer to advance applied conservation in the real world. But on my favorite days, I'm outside playing with plants, hiking, camping, and exploring the natural world.
How did you get into the field?
I always liked nature, and like many kids, I was really drawn to animals when I was young. And I think that something I've realized in retrospect is that in school, we spend so much more time learning about animals than plants. And you sort of learn about biomes and like, oh yeah, the desert exists and there's the tundra and the forest. But it wasn't until I got to college where I got to take some meteor plant classes as a biology major and just became really fascinated by it. And then I had a couple of courses that really started to lead me down this path. The first of which was an ecology class. And so much of, I feel like, biological science education is memorization and regurgitation. And that can feel kind of grueling over time. But when I took ecology, it was all about synthesizing all that stuff I had spent years memorizing and applying it to solve problems in the real world. And that felt really interesting and gratifying to me of, I'm not just saying, okay, this structure is called this, or this is the next step in the Krebs cycle. It was like a fire came through this environment and you're tasked with restoring it. Where do you begin? And that felt like an interesting and challenging question to me. I also had the opportunity to participate in an internship in Western Australia at the end of my time in college, where I worked for the Department of Conservation and Land Management. And that was when I got to do a little bit of everything. It wasn't totally focused on plants, but I did things like water quality sampling and bird surveys and help with herbarium and rare plant surveys. And I also got to camp and hike as part of my job. And I'm from the Chicago suburbs. We camped growing up for vacation, but it never occurred to me that people got to hang out outside and camp for work. And that was sort of a transformative experience for me of, wow, I didn't realize that jobs like this existed. And so from there I went on to graduate school where I studied the effects of invasive plants and air pollution on desert wildflowers in California. And then I got a job as an ecologist for the U.S. Geological Survey, where I studied desert tortoises and their habitat. And that was really fun. The tortoises were amazing to work with and just getting to know them. But it also helped me realize that really focusing on plants was what I wanted. And so after that, I did a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara, where I helped to build a nationwide seed bank to study evolution of wild plants. And also first started working on the genus Clarkia, those farewell to spring wildflowers, thinking about evolution in response to climate change. And then right when my postdoc was ending and I needed a job, the opportunity to help build a rare plant conservation program at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden came available. And I applied for it and I got it. And I spent the next 10 years just doing that, focusing exclusively on rare plant conservation and pushing myself to kind of grow this program and grow myself as a scientist. And just in the beginning of this year was promoted into the Director of Conservation and Research. And yeah, it's been a really rewarding, interesting, and surprising journey, but I'm really thankful for it.
Let's rewind back. You mentioned coming up with scientific questions. What does that mean exactly, and how does that apply to your work?
Yeah, so we have several different kind of flavors of questions that we ask at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. We work from the level of genes all the way up to ecosystems. So depending on which dimension of biodiversity we're thinking about at any given time, it could be questions about how plants are related to each other through evolutionary time. It could be how related is this population of plants to this other one to help inform recovery and restoration. It could be something like, how rare is this plant? What are its threats? And what are some of the things we can do to help it regain traction in the wild? Or we could be thinking about what insects are using plants and how do we make sure that we're rebuilding whole communities and not just gardening when we're doing something like restoration. And then we also have some folks who think a lot about fire, so both in urban landscapes, what are safer alternatives of native plants people can use in their landscapes. And we also have a lichenologist on staff who's thinking about the distribution, abundance, health, and rarity of lichens all across California. So we're really thinking about all different levels of biodiversity.
I didn't even know there. I guess theoretically, I guess I did know that there are lichens like in the woods and stuff, but they seem to me such a northern thing.
Right, right. Yeah, lichens are much less studied in the western US than they are in places like Europe or even just the east coast of North America, where it is a little bit wetter and lichens have gotten more attention. But we do have a nice diversity of lichens across California. We have our state lichen is the California lace lichen. A lot of people mistakenly identify it as Spanish moss, but it's actually a native lichen to California that's adapted to our foggy coasts. And we also have some rare lichens that are threatened by different kinds of environmental disturbance. But there's a lot of room for discovery still in California, which is really fun.
When you're out in the field, let's say you're outside for work, what are you doing?
So for the last 10 years that I've been at the Botanic Garden, my focus has largely been on rare plants and conservation of rare plants. So a lot of my work has been exploratory, either trying to revisit previously documented populations of rare plants, understand where they are, how they're doing now, are there any potential threats. Also trying to use what we know about rare plants to find new populations that haven't been observed before. And so sometimes we're going out on a hike and we think that this is potentially suitable habitat, but we really don't know if we'll find what we're looking for or not. And when we do, it's really exciting. It's always fun to say, hey, there's more of this rare thing than we knew. And then a big part of my work has also been, we have a conservation seed bank at the garden. And so seed collection has been a big part of what I've been doing as we bolster this insurance policy against extinction for California's rare plants.
Can you tell me about a rare plant that you've studied in the past?
Sure, there are so many. I'll tell you about one that is sort of a pet plant of mine. It's called Clarkia holanensis. It's an annual wildflower in the evening primrose family. Many people are familiar, if they're into wildflowers, they're familiar with the group Farewell to Spring. They tend to be later blooming wildflowers. And so this one only occurs in Monterey County. And I started working on it, I'm like, what year is it? Like 9 years ago, I guess. Just trying to figure out what its status was. So there were all these herbarium records, so dried pressed plants that earlier botanists had collected and cataloged. And there were all these records of it across Monterey County, but some of them were quite old. There were a few sites I visited that the last documentation was during the Civil War. And I think the most recent site that I visited had been seen, maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And so I wanted to understand, how's this plant doing? How rare is it? And what I ended up finding was that, not surprisingly, some of the old locations had been developed. They're now shopping malls or housing developments. But also I found a closely related wildflower called Lewis's Clarkia at a lot of the sites. and realized that there had been this taxonomic confusion between these two rare wildflowers that look pretty similar and tend to inhabit pretty similar kinds of habitat. And so once I did all these surveys over several years, came to realize that the plant is much more rare than previously believed. I think I have maybe 6 confirmed sites in Monterey County, and that's the only place it grows. And a few of those are shrinking, it seems like. They're being threatened by invasive weeds. And so that's one that I've been working on for a long time. It's probably deserving of listing under the California Endangered Species Act. And so I've just been working to kind of monitor it and learn as much as I can to try to inform its future recovery.
When you're talking about learning as much as you can, you mentioned kind of where they are, learning unique things about it, like the fact that it might have been miscategorized, and then figuring out what weeds are taking over. What else, like what other information is important for you to gather for kind of the preservation of the species' future?
So one of the things we did was we took seeds from a bunch of different populations of the Halone Clarkia and also the Lewis's Clarkia and grew them in the greenhouse at the garden. And we call that a common garden experiment. So you're taking plants from all different places and growing them in the same environmental conditions. And then we measured a suite of physical characteristics of the plants. So we measured things like petal size. We were interested in the potential difference in mating system for the plants. So many plants are what are called outcrossers, meaning that they receive pollen from other plants of the same species, and that's how they make seeds. Some plants are self-pollinating, which means that their own pollen fertilizes their seeds. And so we measured the distance between the anthers and the stigmas. So this is the male and female reproductive parts in the flowers. And that can give you an idea of how likely that plant is to self. And then we also did a bunch of controlled pollinations looking at whether these two species can hybridize, and if so, can they hybridize in both directions, where you take pollen from Lewis's Clarkia and put it on Halone Clarkia, or you take pollen from Halone Clarkia and put it on Lewis's Clarkia. Just trying to understand, because these things can co-occur, do we think that they're hybridizing in nature? If, is it likely that they would? And then we looked at things like seed size and shape, fruit shape, and a few other characteristics. And then one of the big questions that I have that I haven't been able to answer yet, but I'm always looking for funding for, is the population genomics of Halone Clarkia. So we have these 6 populations. They all occur within at least 20 miles of each other or so, but they're all so far apart that I wouldn't expect that there's any interbreeding happening between them. And so I'm interested to see how much genetic diversity is there among these populations and how closely related are they to each other. And the reason that that's important to understand is because there's one population in particular where in recent years there have been some years where no plants came up, which for annual wildflowers happens sometimes. They usually have seeds stored in the soil, but I haven't seen more than probably 10 plants there in years. And so I'm a little bit worried that that population might wink out. And if it did, it would be great to know how closely related it is to the other populations. If we wanted to try to reestablish it there, we would have a better idea of which source sites we could use seed from. So, it gets a little bit technical and into the weeds, but it really is this whole kind of genes to ecosystems thing, trying to understand as much as possible so that we can make the best informed decisions for management possible.
I am curious because I'm hearing a nuance in what you're saying about taking seeds, planting them in your greenhouse. That is different than the plant being out in the wild. They have different environmental issues. Obviously, You're in a greenhouse, you don't got wind, all of those things.
Right.
So if you're gathering seeds for a seed bank, are those to be grown within a greenhouse if a species were to go extinct, or would you be planting them back where you found them?
That's a great question. So for seed banks, we view them sort of first and foremost as an insurance policy against extinction. So we have this, genetic backup of plant populations in a freezer. And the hope is that if something was to happen in the wild, we could either take those seeds, grow plants in the nursery, do pollinations, and make more seeds, which is often needed for rare plants because it's hard to get really big collections from relatively small populations. Or if it was something like a shrub, we might be more likely to use the seeds to grow plants and then put plants back out, so do some more kind of classic restoration like people think of. But something that we've been working a lot on and testing on the Channel Islands in particular is doing the first thing that I described, which is to grow plants from our seed bank in our nursery, conduct hand pollinations to make more seeds, and then taking those seeds back out into the wild and setting up what we're referring to as recovery plots, where we're trying to either introduce rare plants to places where they haven't occurred before, but we think the habitat is suitable, or we're trying to bolster an existing population by adding some more seeds to the population. And people don't do restoration by seed a lot in this way. If you're, maybe working in the prairie and you have just tons of seed, people do more seeding. But I think in California, a lot of restoration has focused on growing plants, putting them in containers, and then planting those containers. But that doesn't work well for annual wildflowers, which are small and have a short lifespan. And it also costs a lot more, it takes a lot more time and energy to plant container plants. And so trying to figure out how to do this with seeds for rare plants is something that could be, if we figure out how to do it well, that could be potentially scaled up for other kinds of restoration activities as well.
What are the rules around collecting seeds from rare plants?
Yeah, so many. So in California, we have, thankfully, a lot of people who care about the environment, and so we have a few different kinds of rare plant classification that we can use. So the California Native Plant Society is our natural heritage group for plants in California, and they have a very extensive rare plant inventory. And we have about 6,600 kinds of native plants in California. More than a third of them are considered rare by CNPS, the California Native Plant Society. And within their inventory, there's a ranking system from very rare and imperiled, which would get a 1B. They also classify things that are either extinct or extinct in California but occur elsewhere. But for things that we know exist still, we have these 1Bs that are really rare, all the way down to things that they call 4s, which are kind of on a watch list. It's like these things are uncommon. It's possible that they could decline and become more rare. And for anything with a 1B, that rarest rank from CNPS, they do get a little bit more consideration for things like mitigation when development's happening, and also for when we're collecting them. So the reason I'm telling you this is because we also have state and federal classifications for rare plants. We have the California Endangered Species Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act, both of which have listed plants in California. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. But a lot of the state and federal agencies in California have adopted the California Rare Plant Inventory, and things that classify as that 1B category with CNPS will also require permitting for collections, just like you would need for state or federally listed plants. So it's kind of a long way of saying that you need permits, usually from the state or federal government if it's state or federally listed, and almost always from the landowner. And so there's a lot of hurdles to jump through, and not just anybody can collect seeds of rare plants.
What do you wish more people understood about your work?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, gosh, I mean, there are so many things. I feel like when I started this job 10 years ago, I spent a lot of time answering the question, why does saving rare plants matter? They tend to be uncommon on the landscape, and it can sometimes be unclear how much difference it would make if you lose a plant that occurs in one place in the world. But, for myself, there are a lot of reasons that are I think, equally important for why we would want to do that. For myself, I'm someone who just values nature and biodiversity and life in general, and I think that, rare plants have equal claim to living on Earth just as much as the rest of us. But for folks who need a little bit more encouragement, we're continuously finding that rare plants play unique roles in ecosystems. They can, like I was mentioning with those farewell to spring wildflowers, they tend to flower later in the spring when a lot of other wildflowers have finished, which means that they're offering forage to pollinators at a time when there are fewer flowers available. The same can happen with, there's an example of some rare plants in alpine environments that are very early germinators, and they provide important food for nestlings of birds in high elevation areas. And then the other thing is that if we often don't know the role that rare plants play, they tend to be understudied because they're uncommon and they're difficult to work with because you need permits. And so we don't always know what would be lost, but we might feel the effects later. I want people to know that every scrap of biodiversity is important and that it's worth saving. But I'd also like them to know that this work is really fun and filled with adventure, I think more than I even understood when I started it myself. I think that sometimes when people think about scientists and botany, it can seem a little bit stuffy, but we spend a lot of time sleeping in tents and hiking on trails and just having magical experiences in nature. And so I guess I hope that people, young people especially, understand that it's a really interesting and viable career path as well.
What's the coolest thing you've ever done at work?
Oh, gosh. That's really hard to answer, but I think I have so many things that have been so cool to me, but one thing that I think other people will also appreciate as really cool is that on the Channel Islands, on Santa Cruz Island in particular, I've had the opportunity to do a number of surveys for rare plants using helicopters. And so we fly around the island in this helicopter with no doors on it, and then they land it in some place that would be really hard to get to on foot, sometimes on the top of a ridgeline. And, they might put one pad down and you hop out, you crouch down, the helicopter takes off, and I'm just alone on this ridge top looking for rare plants on Santa Cruz Island, and that is pretty cool.
That is cool. What's the hardest part of your job?
Oh, I think there are a few things. I think logistically it can be intellectually grueling just trying to develop all of these projects, manage them, execute them, get funding for them. We rely a lot on grants and contracts as well as donations. And so it's sort of, you can feel like you're in like a hamster wheel of just trying to always have enough work and get it all done. And then I think existentially, it's just the biodiversity crisis that our planet is facing. And for me, it helps a lot to know that myself and everyone at the garden and a lot of our colleagues in the state, the country, across the world are all working to chip away at that problem. But sometimes it's a bit heavy to sit with it. And so I think for conservationists, when we start to feel that heaviness, the best way to shake it off is to take action. And so that's what I try to do. But yeah, those are some of the challenges for sure.
I am curious, for anyone who's not a biologist or, let's say, a politician with decision-making power, what is something that a regular person could do to help out?
That's a great question. At the garden, a big part of our mission is to spread the message of conservation to the public, help people understand not just why this matters, but to your point, what they can do. And there are a lot of different paths that people can take to help. Everything from becoming a member at a garden like ours that cares about conservation, that's an important thing to do, and it really does move the needle for us. Just recreating in nature and building up a personal relationship and appreciation with nature, I think is, one of the easiest things that folks can do. voting is really important. I always say, vote your heart when it comes to the environment. If this is something you care about, you should look at people's record on the environment. And then planting a native plant in your yard, on your patio, on your balcony, if you have an apartment. Every time someone does that, we're creating these pockets of habitat in urban environments. And that does make a difference. And if if you want to be a real superstar, things like volunteering, if you're a person looking for a career, devoting your life to this, advocating for conservation and the environment, there's just so many ways, and whatever way appeals to people, I think, is valuable. And if the most you can do and the thing that's the most impactful for you is to look outside and observe the plants and animals in your area, that still matters. Because at the end of the day, the only way any of this happens is with people caring about nature. And so that's the first step.
I am curious, you were talking earlier about kind of weeds being a danger to some rare plants. What are in the invasive species that people should be most worried about possibly planting in their yards?
Right, so that's a good question. A lot of the invasive species that we see every day, like I think a lot of at least Southern Californians will be familiar with black mustard, which paints the hills that kind of highlighter yellow every spring. And then a lot of the annual grasses like ripgut brome or red brome that we see cheatgrass around. A lot of those things aren't things that people are planting in their yards. But some of the things that people do still plant in their yards that are invasive are things like pampas grass, fountain grass, the things like vinca or ivy can escape, tree of heaven. There's a whole suite, and there's some good information about this through the California Invasive Plant Council that looks both at wildland weeds but also escaped horticultural weeds. And so if you're not sure, going to a native plant garden or your local botanic garden is also a really good place to get good advice about what to plant or not.
I'm also curious, you talked earlier about working with old collections of kind of like pressed flowers and stuff. Mm-hmm. What is that like? Are these all just cataloged at universities and old scrapbooks, or what are the materials like?
Yeah, so I think this is in relation to the herbarium specimens, right? So we have at our garden and a number of botanic gardens, a lot of universities have historically had herbaria, but unfortunately some of them are divesting from their herbaria because they take up a lot of space. They require paid staff to curate them and a certain level of expertise, and universities are increasingly getting away from sort of more basic natural history type of science. But our garden, and like I said, many other places, an herbarium is really just a collection of pressed and dried plants. So when a botanist goes out in the field and wants to create a lasting record of what they saw, they'll collect either a whole plant in the case of an annual wildflower or a piece of a plant in the case of a shrub or tree. They'll collect some data associated with that sample. They'll press it in newspaper and cardboard and kind of squish it. We'll put straps to tighten it down, and then we'll put it in a low heat dryer to suck some of the moisture out so they become a lot more dry and fragile. And then these plants get mounted on archival acid-free paper, and they get a label with all their associated data. And then they sit in herbarium cabinets, which are often airtight cabinets. And it can seem like sort of an esoteric exercise of, okay, we're collecting these pieces of plants and drying them and then putting them in a cabinet. But they provide really valuable data for where plants were when, and increasingly they're being used for large data analyses focused on phenology, which is the study of life cycle events. And there have been some really interesting papers coming out about how the timing of the onset of spring blooms, for example, has changed in response to climate change. Because especially for common plants, we can have hundreds of thousands of specimens of one species from a large geographic area and a lot of time points. And so you can really use it as an indication of how the environment has changed. But to more directly answer your question, when we work with these really old specimens, It's really fun. It's like a time capsule. You'll pull out this old press specimen that was collected by somebody in the 1800s, possibly on horseback, just living a completely different life than we're living now. And the plants are usually quite frail at that point. These specimens can last for many hundreds of years. And one thing that I really enjoy is that often these days, the labels are printed on a printer. They're typed and printed. But the old labels are usually handwritten in beautiful cursive that, most people used that to write in the old days. And so that's kind of fun too, to just see sort of the flair of the collector and how they wrote about their specimen. I think that the narrative text is a lot more poetic in some cases than it is now, where we just treat it more like this is a data field, but yeah, it's pretty fun to get to see what those plants looked like after all these years.
That is really interesting. For my last, I guess, quite broad question, what's your favorite part of your job?
Field work, yeah, just getting to be out in nature is the most rewarding part for me. It's funny because I think the longest days are always in the field. I can spend 15 hours outside hiking around looking for plants, and that is way more energizing to me than if I were to spend 15 hours on a spreadsheet, and so much of my job has been getting to go to these remote places that most people don't get to see and find plants that most people don't know exist. And I just feel like I get to see all these secret parts of the natural world, and it's really fun. It's an adventure.
That's incredible. And if anyone wants to follow your work or follow the garden's work online, where should they go?
Sure. So the garden's website is our one-stop shop for finding out what we're doing, and that's sbbotanicgarden.org. But we also have social media on Instagram and LinkedIn, so there are a few different places that people can follow us.
Great. That's amazing. Thank you so much for your time. And that's it for this week on the Interesting Jobs podcast, where we chat with people with interesting jobs. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And if you have an interesting job or know someone with one, email us and let us know. We might even be able to have you on the show.